All right. Hello, students. Welcome back. Today we are going to get into talking about foundations of the Atlantic world. This is chapter 5 of your textbook, and this is part 1 of a two-part lecture. So you can see we have quite a few key terms to get through in this lecture. We're going to talk about the Protestant Reformation and the consequences of that. And then we're going to talk about exploration of North America and some of the motivations behind that, and then also the Spanish exploration and conquest of North America and Portuguese exploration of Africa. Hopefully today's lecture will answer the following questions. What is the Protestant Reformation and why is it important in European history? What motivated Portuguese and Spanish exploration and what was the consequence of the exploration? And then finally, what is the significance of the Columbian Exchange? So just a quick overview here. In the 16th century, in the 1500s, we are going to see a huge transformation take place in European society. There are really two factors that are driving this. The first is exploration, conquest, and colonization of different parts of the world by European empires. And then the religious transformation, which is equally as significant, which is the Protestant Reformation. So those are the two major transformations that are taking place, and that is what we will be focusing on today in this lecture. So let's begin by talking about the origins of the Protestant Reformation. So if we were to go back in time to 1492 when Columbus landed in the New World, that would be a time in European history in which everybody in Europe was Roman Catholic. And there was a very close relationship between political leaders, kings and queens, and the Catholic Church. But that starts to change as we get into the latter part of the 1400s and the early part of the 1500s. There starts to be questioning of the church. And this had to do with the fact that over time, a lot of corruption had really entered into the church. Priests were not honoring their vows of celibacy. Many priests would, either be married sort of, unofficially or have illegitimate children. Many priests were living very lavish lifestyles and kind of flaunting their wealth. There were lots of kickbacks to people internally, so there was like a lot of nepotism. There was some bribing. There was the selling of indulgences, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. But essentially, there's a lot of corruption, and people are starting to question the church as a institution. And so what we start to see emerging, and this begins in the 1400s, is something called Christian humanism. And this is really this desire to have a true spiritual experience from your religion. And the Christian humanists really believed that by purifying these rituals and these belief structures that already existed within the Roman Catholic Church, that they would be able to attain a true religious, genuine spiritual transformation. And so the Christian humanistic philosophies are circulating around Europe. There's a lot of writers that are talking about this, and it's going to end up influencing a lot of the people that are going to found the Protestant Reformation. The other thing that's happening that's really important to understand, because when Martin Luther starts the Reformation, he's really responding to a specific practice in the church, and that is the sale of indulgences. So the idea of indulgences is essentially that uh, the indulgences were kind of like a way to reduce or even cancel the time after death, which people needed to suffer in purgatory to atone for their sins before reaching heaven. And typically it was believed that you could do some kind of great work, like something of great religious merit, such as going on a crusade or perhaps going on a pilgrimage. But the church also taught that the Pope controlled a store of these merits amassed by Jesus and the Christian saints. So there was like this excess of merits built up from the good works of Jesus and the saints. And those virtues were so great that they were leftover merit, so to speak. And the church could sell or allot some of these extra merits and sell them in the form of an indulgence. And the way in which they got around it in their minds was, okay, you could buy this, and that is the good work that you were doing because you were supporting the church by buying the indulgence. And in that way, you could spend less time in purgatory to atone for your sins and kind of go straight to heaven. Well, the Christian humanists and other people that were seeking sort of a more pure and genuine spiritual experience from the religion really were opposed to this. So that will lead us to Martin Luther, who in 1517 in the city of Wittenberg, Germany, will post a document with 95 theses, basically outlining these corruptions that were happening within the Catholic Church. And initially, really, Luther had in his mind that he just wanted to reform the church, that I think, at least initially, did not think that he was going to create a whole separate religion. But his 95 Theses will get circulated around the church. They will eventually make their way back to the Pope. And Martin Luther is brought in front of the Pope and asked to recant and basically, deny a lot of his points in his theses. He refuses to do so, and in 1521 he's excommunicated, which from the church, which essentially meant that he was no longer allowed to engage in the spiritual activities of the church. Martin Luther is a really interesting historic figure. He was a priest, but also a professor. And he was always really obsessed with this idea of salvation. So for him, the selling of the indulgences was really like um, creating a situation where people could, you know, get around doing good works and instead just pay for their ability to get into heaven. And he had a real sort of moral and ethical objection to that. And so that was his primary problem. But there were lots of other corruptions within the church, as I've already mentioned. So it was sort of a culmination of all of that. When he does this, he decides that he is going to continue on with his theology, and he goes on to found the Lutheran religion, of course, named after himself. And the Lutherans will begin the process of separating their theology from Catholic theology, and this creates a huge schism, right, religiously throughout Europe. So people are essentially forced to decide, am I going to stay Roman Catholic, which is what they were probably born and raised as, or am I going to switch to this new religion? So it's important to understand the difference between these two theologies before we move on. And these two theologies really differed from each other in some very important ways. The first is that Catholics had this belief in religious faith and good works, was sort of the way in which people achieved eternal salvation, right? The way in which people were able to get into heaven was through your faith, number one, but secondly, also your good works. And they believed, as I have already mentioned, that buying an indulgence was regarded as a good work because that money went to the church. So that's kind of how they got around that part. But Luther, on the other hand, taught that faith alone was sufficient for salvation, and that humans were unable to work towards their own redemption, which depended entirely upon God. So what Luther is saying is you believe in God, and then God decides whether or not you are worthy of redemption and salvation. And the Catholics are saying you believe in God and you do good works, and that's enough to be saved. Um, this was it's very important to understand these two differences because they are important in understanding the way in which the churches are structured, right? So Luther believed that the scripture, the Bible, the religious writings of Christianity alone was the source of Christian belief and practice. So in other words, read the Bible, interpret the Bible, and have your own sort of private relationship with the Bible and with your faith. And on the other hand, you have the Catholics who believe that the scripture is interpreted through the church's hierarchy. So the priest and the popes and the bishops, and they all are interpreting the scripture and then kind of delivering it to you through these traditions and these rituals, such as the Mass, right? Luther and all of the Lutherans all abandoned almost all of the traditional Catholic rituals, and they also allowed the clergy to marry. And Luther himself actually married a former nun. And so, again, major differences, right? So the structures of the churches themselves, the hierarchical structure of the churches themselves, but also how people are reaching eternal salvation is very different in these two religious ideologies. So Luther's ideas spread pretty rapidly, particularly around the German-speaking lands of the Holy Roman Empire. So here you can see a map of Europe at the time, and you can see France, you can see the Holy Roman Empire, you see the Ottoman Empire there, who's, stretched pretty far into Europe, and we talked about them when we talked about the Islamic empires. And then you see Italy, which is a group of city-states, and then you see Spain and Portugal. And the areas there in the Holy Roman Empire are really, Lutheranism is spreading pretty rapidly in those regions, and will also end up spreading to the Netherlands and other places um, in the Nordic countries. But the Catholic, obviously, the Catholic and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V opposed Protestantism. And so this is an issue because obviously he is the ruler of of the Holy Roman Empire. And so there was a lot of fighting and resistance and all types of back and forth about this until the Peace of Augsburg was agreed upon in 1555, which allowed for rulers to convert to Lutheranism only in their areas. So basically, if you have a little kingdom or a little principality, and you decide that you want to become Lutheran, then you can become Lutheran and your people can be Lutheran, but only within the boundaries of your little principality. Obviously not an ideal uh, arrangement, but it did lead to at least a, um, a temporary solution to what is going to become a very big ongoing problem in Europe, and is going to cause many, many years of war and fighting. So while Martin Luther's ideas were very radical for the time and definitely departed from the traditions of the Catholic Church in some very substantial ways, there were some followers of Luther that actually took it even farther. And these leaders, like Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin, they'll start movements that will totally disrupt traditional Catholic practice. The first was a rejection of transmutation. So, transmutation is the belief that during communion, when you eat the wafer and you drink the wine, that you are actually, that Jesus's body and blood is actually embodied in that ritual, right? So you are actually ingesting the blood and the body of Jesus when you take communion. That is the Catholic belief, and this idea of transmutation of the spirit of Jesus going into the bread and the wine was one that had traditionally been held by Catholics. And both Zwingli and Calvin are going to reject that idea. There's also just sort of a general rejection by Zwingli and Calvin of rituals of all sorts. So the Mass, a lot of the saints' days celebrations, those types of things are going to be rejected. Rejection of church ornamentation. So having a lot of statues in the church, stained glass in the church, artwork in the church, any type of ornamentation, big candle holders, those types of things. They did not believe in that. They believed in a very austere church environment, a very sort of plain looking church. And so they're rejecting that. Zwingli is kind of like the leader of the Anabaptist movement, and this is a movement that will eventually have some influence in North America and in the founding of the colonies, because a lot of the Anabaptists will actually move to North America in the early English colonies. But this is the belief that adult baptism is the only true baptism, because the belief that in order to reject sin and truly be purified from sin, that you have to be an adult to make that decision. And so adult baptism becomes the norm in like Mennonite communities, Amish communities. Those are all Anabaptist religious sects. And then finally, John Calvin, who is well, he's the founder of Calvinism. His big contribution was this belief in predestination. And predestination is the idea that God has predetermined whether or not you are going to be saved when you die. And it's determined at birth. So it's not like something that you can really do anything about throughout your lifetime. You either are one of the chosen ones or you are not. So people that believe in predestination often will choose to live very austere lives, rejecting things like drinking and gambling and those dancing and those types of things, in order to kind of bring themselves closer to this idea of godliness, in the hopes that they are one of the chosen ones. A good example of a Calvinist influence in America would be the Puritans. The Puritans were Calvinist, and they believed in this idea of predestination. So these are these religious ideas are going to influence further division within the Protestant branch. So you are going to get like Presbyterians and Puritans, and as I said, Mennonites and Amish, and all of those like sub branches of Protestantism are going to come from these more radical religious thinkers that were inspired by Martin Luther. Okay, so we're going to turn to talking about the English Reformation now, and this will take a kind of a strange and bizarre twist. So, on the European mainland, you have people like Martin Luther and Zwingli and Calvin and the Anabaptists, and they're all very serious about their doctrine and their theologies and breaking away from the Catholic Church for their various reasons. In England, the breakaway from the Roman Catholic Church really comes from the top down, and it comes initially from a king, King Henry VIII, who basically wanted a divorce, and he wanted a divorce from his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and she was the daughter of the famous Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand in Spain. And the reason that King Henry wanted a divorce, or actually an annulment, which is what he asked for, because technically he was unable to get a divorce because it was not legal within the Catholic Church to get divorced. But you could ask for an annulment, which essentially made it so that you were never technically married. And so he asked the Pope for an annulment because he says that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was never legitimate because she had actually at one time been married to his brother. His brother had died, and that it was a sin to marry your brother's wife. And so he gave this sort of argument to try to get out of his marriage. The true reason why he wanted to get out of his marriage is that he wanted a male heir, and he had his eye on another woman by the name of Anne Boleyn, who he thought could give him a male heir. So he just wanted out of the marriage so that he could marry somebody else. In total, he will have 6 wives, famously. And there's a little song that goes with it: divorced, beheaded, and died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. So he did divorce. He did cut off the heads of a couple of his wives after accusing them of adultery. But back to this story of how the Church of England is created. So he asked the Pope for an annulment. The Pope says, no, you're stuck in this marriage. And so when this happens, King Henry VIII decides that he is going to pass through Parliament, with the help of Parliament, the Act of Supremacy in 1534, which essentially creates the Church of England and puts the monarch at the head of the church instead of the Pope. So this was his way of breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church. In reality, the original incarnation of the Anglican Church, as it was called, or sometimes called the Church of England, in reality, it really was much like the Catholic Church, except for that, of course, the king was at the head of the church, and the king seized a bunch of the land that had once belonged to the Catholic Church in England and took it for himself. Okay, so the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, is really losing its grip and its power across Europe as these religious transformations are taking place and these new religious sects are being created. And so the Catholic Church realizes that it has to respond to a lot of these criticisms. And so it comes together for a council called the Council of Trent in 1545. And it organizes sort of a counter Reformation, an answer to the Protestant Reformation. And several important uh, transformations or improvements are made at the Council of Trent. The first is that well, first off, they acknowledge that indulgences are something real. Like they say that it's an actual real thing, that the merit actually does exist and has been built up. But the sale of indulgences will forevermore be prohibited. So no more sale of indulgences, but they do exist. They want to make that clear. And then secondly, they're prohibiting the appointment of family members to positions in the church. So they're trying to cut down on the nepotism. They are discouraging lavish lifestyles of priests, reminding priests that they take a vow of poverty and that they should live modestly. And then a new religious order is created, the Jesuits, and they are going to be put in charge of not only educating a lot of the new priests that are going to be brought up, but also going out and on missionary missions to the new world and to different areas that are being colonized in Christian areas. So, like the Spanish, for example, will bring with them Jesuit missionaries, at least initially. So the Counter Reformation did, in some ways, maybe reaffirm some of people who were on the fence and wanted to stay within the Catholic Church, but they were kind of in agreement that there was a lot of corruption. So maybe the Council of Trent helped maintain a lot of those Catholics within their faith. Um, but it also is going to serve to further tensions between the two sides. And this ends up becoming a very violent transition throughout Europe as these two faiths really struggle with each other. And these violent these violent attacks against each other are going to continue well into the next century, into the 17th century. So inevitably, this tension is really going to erupt in all sorts of violent episodes. And really, this period of European history is really a series of wars of religion. And it varies in severity and to what degree, depending upon what area of Europe you're talking about. The worst was really within the Holy Roman Empire, which is, where a lot of these German-speaking areas were that wanted to break away from the Catholic Church, and that's going to end up, devolving into the 30 Years' War, which we will talk about in a minute. In England, the English and the Church of England are basically experiencing opposition from people like the Puritans, and the Puritans are the ones who are the Calvinists. They want to see a true Reformation within England. As I mentioned, the Church of England maintained a lot of its Catholic-like traditions, and so there was a lot of opposition amongst true, Protestants that wanted to see more of a true Reformation. So there's going to be some persecution of these groups. And of course, we know this leads to eventually a lot of those groups leaving England and going on to the English colonies in the New World, establishing places like the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts. In France, you have really two groups that emerge in opposition to each other: the Catholics, which, France really maintained a very strong Catholic faith, and the Huguenots, the French Huguenots. And the Huguenots are basically the French Calvinists. So they are that sort of more radical sect of Protestantism. They believe in predestination. They believe in very austere church environment. They believe in the stripping down and the sort of not having any sort of church rituals at all. And there's a big clash that happens in France on St. Bartholomew Day, and that's in 1572. And it results in, there's a big royal wedding that's set to happen in France. And a bunch of Huguenots are coming, very prominent Huguenots are coming to the wedding, and some Catholic assassins essentially attack this wedding party, and there's a huge massacre that takes place. What ends up happening as a result of that is King Henry IV of France decides that he is going to publicly, um, announce that he is Catholic, that he is going to ally himself with the Catholic Church, which is what the majority of French people were. But he's also going to pass the Edict of Nantes, and that happens in 1598. And this edict essentially allows for the French Huguenots to live peacefully within France. So this was huge, and also pretty progressive for the time period. And it allowed then for the Huguenots and the Catholics, at least from 1598 on, to live in relative peace with each other. In the Spanish Netherlands, the war is going to continue to rage because the Netherlands were controlled by Spain, a very Catholic country, and you're going to have a series of rulers beginning with Philip II that are going to oppose the Protestant transformations that are happening in the Netherlands. So war is going to continue there between 1568 and 1609, eventually ending up with the Netherlands withdrawing from the Spanish Empire and essentially becoming their own country and area. And then there's the 30 Years' War, which takes place from 1618 to 1648. And this is really going to be fought throughout that Holy Roman Empire area between Catholic and Protestant states. So it's fought in what's basically modern day Germany. Lots of people suffered, lots of people died, lots of people had their livelihoods destroyed, their farms destroyed, cities were destroyed. It was a very, very brutal war. It will end with the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, and this essentially leads to an acknowledgement that each area will establish an independent entity from each other. And that ended up being about 1,000 independent entities, which was once the Holy Roman Empire, different entities, some being Catholic and some being Protestant. And that was the way in which they were able to resolve this issue. But it's important because obviously it ends the war, but it also essentially leads to the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire, which had sort of loosely united that region for quite some time. All right, so we're going to move away from talking about the religious wars in Europe as a result of the Protestant Reformation and begin to talk now about exploration. And specifically, we're going to talk about early exploration of North America. So the earliest recorded, at least what we can find evidence of exploration of North America, happens with the Vikings. And it's the Viking explorer Leif Erikson who, in about 1000 CE, will discover or come across, if you will, the coast of Newfoundland. And in Newfoundland, he is going to find a land where wild grapes grow, and he ends up calling it Vinland. They establish a colony there, and this particular colony wasn't found until the 1960s. So this was all kind of speculation that the Vikings had been to North America until they found evidence of it in the 1960s. It's pretty clear that the Vikings also had contact with the indigenous people, which they called Skreglings, of North America. It's the legacy is kind of mixed. Like they do report that they had warred with them, but then they also reported having traded with them. So it's kind of unclear exactly what their relationship was like. And it's not really clear which indigenous group they came from either. But the 20th century digs in Nova Scotia have verified much of the information that are found in the Icelandic sagas of Finland. As I mentioned, in the 1960s, explorer Helge and Anne Ingstad discovered in Newfoundland, Canada, the buried ruins of a Viking camp from around the time of Ericsson's explorations in a place called Lance aux Meadows. And this find definitively proved at last that the North had traveled to the Americas way before Columbus. Over the years, there's been a lot of suggestions about early exploration of North America. You know, people have speculated that Irish monks settled, had sailed across the Atlantic, that African sailors had made it across the Atlantic, perhaps even Chinese members of Admiral Zhang He's treasure fleet had made it across. But there is absolutely no proof of any of this, so it's hard to say definitively. The settlements in Newfoundland, however, with the Vikings, they never became permanent, likely because of conflicts with the indigenous people. And by the 1400s, the frontier colonies of Greenland, populated by Norse people, had all but disappeared. So these colonies disappear by the 1400s, and they're not there when Columbus arrives, but they do remain very prominent in the Norse sagas. And now that there's evidence, it's pretty clear that there was definitely Norse influence in Newfoundland. One of the video links in your resources links this week has a video of the Meadow place, so I encourage you to check that out. Okay, so I know we've talked a little bit about European exploration already, but I want to talk specifically about what's allowing the Europeans to explore at this time, and also some of the motivations as well. So, just as a reminder, in 1453, the Ottoman Empire will take the city of Constantinople, rename it Istanbul, and move significantly into Eastern Europe. So we even saw them on the map when I showed you the map of the Holy Roman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire is stretching far and wide, and it's in a very strategic location geographically, in where it basically straddles the East and the West, right? It's right in that Middle East area where they can kind of control the trade from Asia. And so in order to eliminate these Ottoman middlemen, the Europeans are highly motivated to gain their own access to Asia, right? This is made possible through a bunch of navigational advancements, all of which are non-Western. So you have first the lateen sail, and the lateen sail is a triangular shaped sail that's invented by Arab navigators, and essentially what it does is it allows for ships to sail upwind, right? So it allows for maneuverability upwind. Then you also have the stern post rudder, which was invented by the Chinese, and this also allows for swifter and more accurate maneuvers in the water. You have the astrolabe, which was actually a Greek invention. It's an ancient invention, and it was used before the chronometer, which will be another huge navigational invention. But this will help mariners find their north and south position on the Earth's surface. and it will be refined in the Middle East and then reintroduced to Europe through Islamic mariners. The magnetic compass coming from China made its way to Europe in the 15th century, and the adaptation of these inventions will ultimately allow Europeans to abandon their long-standing practice of simply sailing along the coast. So with these instruments, they are now able to go into the open ocean, which of course allows for more exploration. And then finally, the financial backing. So the Comenda system, which was a system that was originated is in the Islamic trading networks, is a system by which private financing for merchants to go out and find new markets was available. So these merchants would be motivated financially to go and find new markets by private lenders who were willing to fund their expeditions to expand their trading networks. So all of these things together, the motivation to compete with the Ottomans, the navigational advancements and technologies, and the financial backing, these were really the things that were driving European exploration. Okay, so we're going to begin talking about European exploration with the Portuguese, which makes a lot of sense. The Portuguese were a maritime country. They had a country that looked out onto the ocean. They relied upon the ocean for a lot of their livelihoods, fishing, etc. And so it makes sense that the Portuguese are really going to lead the way here with exploration of the Atlantic. And in the 1340s, King Alfonso IV of Portugal raised public funds to build a commercial fleet that by the 15th century had transformed the nation into a maritime power. So it starts very early in the 1300s. In 1341, the Portuguese sailed to the Canary Islands in the Atlantic off of the coast of Africa, and this was only the beginning of their exploration and conquest. In 1450, John I, the grandson of Alfonso IV, dispatched Portuguese forces to capture the North Moroccan city of Ceuta. And John hoped that control of a port on the North African coast would open that continent to both conquest and trade. So the Portuguese take Ceuta and basically claim it for themselves. And this literally gives them a solid outpost there on the African continent. To further cement his control of the region, he requested papal recognition of his efforts. And in April 1418, Pope Martin V granted the Portuguese king the right to all African lands taken from Muslim rulers. So again, you see this connection, right, between conquest and religion. And it seems to be something that constantly runs through as a constant theme here. Under Johnson, who was named Prince Henry, dubbed the Navigator by historians because of how much he explored, the Portuguese explorers claimed the Madeira Islands, the Azores, and the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of Africa. They also sailed down the western coast of Africa to as far as today's Sierra Leone. And of course, eventually it will be the Portuguese expeditions that reached the southern tip of Africa in 1488. Bartholomew Diaz, who we've talked about already in this course, who had participated in the Battle of Ceuta, sailed around the Cape of Good Hope to reach the eastern side of the continent. The other thing that was motivating a lot of this exploration of Africa was this very interesting legend, the legend of Prester John. And the image that you see here on this slide is actually a blow up of a map of Africa in which Prester John is located. And he's located in like the middle of central North Africa on the map. And it's said that he is ruling over like a very large Christian kingdom, which for the Portuguese and for other Christian explorers was a big deal, right? Because Africa was looked at as being primarily either Muslim or tribal groups. And so this also motivated people to continue to look. Now, Prester John was never found, and this mythical Christian kingdom was never discovered, but he was placed on maps, and there was legends of this, magnificent Christian kingdom within the depths of Africa. The Portuguese, as we know, were also responsible for establishing the trade routes between Africa and European powers. And they established these slave trading networks in the 1440s. So the first shipment of enslaved Africans will arrive in Portugal in 1441. And the Portuguese will also establish relationships with some powerful African kingdoms, like in Benin and in the Congo. In the Congo, the members of the Congo's ruling family actually converted to Roman Catholicism and even adopted Portuguese names. So it's interesting. So the Portuguese have sort of a jump start on this exploration of Africa, but again, establishing this slave trading with African kingdoms was really critical because, as we know, other European powers are going to follow suit there. Okay, so we know that the Spanish are going to follow the Portuguese in terms of exploration, but it's going to take them a while. And the reason that it takes them a while is the Spanish are busy consolidating their power in their Christian kingdom in Spain. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand funded a bunch of what were called reconquistas of the Iberian Peninsula in Spain specifically. The Reconquista was a series of attacks on both the Jewish communities and the Muslim communities in Spain. And essentially it led to inquisitions, and during these inquisitions or these interrogations that they would do, people were either forced to self-exile out of Spain, leave Spain, or they were forced to convert to Christianity. The idea being that they did not want any non-Christians within Spain. And so this Reconquista project took all of their finances and energy all the way up until 1492. And in 1492, they declare that the Reconquista has been a success and is complete. And the king and queen of Spain, Isabella and Ferdinand, decide that they are going to fund the voyages of exploration of Christopher Columbus. And he had been asking them to fund this voyage for quite some time. He believed that the Earth was about 12,500 miles in circumference, which is about exactly half of what it actually is. It's about actually more like 25,000. And so he thought that if you sailed west, that you would reach off the coast of, India or Japan or something like that. So, and he estimated, the time that it would take and everything. And so he does just that in 1492, when, of course, he's given a fleet of 3 ships, and he leaves Spain and he goes across the Atlantic and he lands in the Caribbean. And they end up establishing their headquarters, at least at first, on the island of Hispaniola, which is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And eventually they move their capital to Cuba, and then eventually to Mexico City, Tenochtitlan. At the time that the Spanish reached the Americas, it is estimated that the population of native people was somewhere around 75 million people. And that, of course, includes North, Central, and South America in total. Colonization was led by a group of men that are now known as the conquistadors. They were essentially soldiers, but they weren't always they weren't always professionally trained soldiers. They were just people that were willing to go out and explore and fight and claim land for the king and queen of Spain. Of course, Hernan Cortez is probably one of the most famous of these conquistadors. Cortez comes to the Americas at a young age, just the age of 19. And he ends up getting an encomida, which is essentially a piece of land, a land grant, and a group of indigenous people to work the land. So this encomienda system becomes a motivation for a lot of young men who don't have a lot of opportunity in Spain to come to the Americas to, find a way to, generate wealth and everything. So Cortez is one of those. He comes to Cuba, he gets an encomida, and then he decides that he wants to explore mainland Mexico. He's heard of a couple of other expeditions that had sailed along the coast, and they had heard from the indigenous people that they came across it. There was this, kingdom in the interior of Mexico that was, laden with riches and gold and stuff. And Cortez was fascinated by this. So he, of course, goes out on this expedition from Cuba. He gets to mainland Mexico and establishes what is now Veracruz, the town of Veracruz, and essentially scuttles his boats. He destroys his entire fleet, basically to show the men that he is serious about staying and completing the mission. And he eventually does trek inland and comes across Tenochtitlan, which is the capital of the Aztec Empire in what is now Mexico City. This beautiful, built environment with floating gardens and temples and pyramids and all kinds of things. You can see some artist renderings here. And in a couple of years, after a couple of years, he meets the head of the Aztecs, Montezuma, puts him under essentially what is house arrest, and, starts the process of essentially taking over their empire. But it's not an easy task. There are a lot of people who are very loyal to Montezuma, and it takes quite some time. And the Spanish would not have been successful had it not really been from the help of some of the neighboring tribes who didn't like the Aztecs. And so Cortez was able to ally himself with those people in an effort to eventually overthrow the Aztecs and Montezuma. So that happens in 1521. The capital of New Spain is moved to Mexico City, and further exploration takes place from there, including out to the west coast of Mexico, out into the Gulf, where the Baja Peninsula is spotted, etc. Francisco Pizarro will be the conquistador that will go south into South America, conquering eventually the Incan Empire in 1532. All of these conquests were violent in nature, but also they were bringing with them invisible pathogens, right? Diseases that were killing the indigenous and weakening the indigenous population. So that was really to their advantage. And so these conquests will eventually lead to widespread colonization by the Spanish of Mexico, Central America, and South America. So obviously, the conquest of the Americas is going to have really lasting and devastating impact on the indigenous population. But there's also another a consequence of this encounter, and that's something called the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is the exchange or the back and forth flow of goods between the Western and Eastern hemispheres as a result of the discovery of the Americas. It really begins in 1492 with Columbus. I mean, when Columbus leaves the area, he actually brings with him some indigenous people back to Spain. And so from the very beginning, there's this back and forth and trading of goods. What are they exchanging? Well, they're exchanging different types of plants. They're exchanging animals. They're exchanging food stuff. Obviously, diseases. And this was particularly impactful for the indigenous populations who didn't have any of the immunities to those diseases. Ideas are being transferred back and forth, religious practices, right? The Spanish brought with them the missionaries, and the missionaries' job was to go out and convert the indigenous population to Catholicism. Enslaved people are going to begin to be brought over. Well, they enslaved some of the indigenous people, at least initially, but that didn't work out very well because many of them died. And so ultimately, a lot of the enslavement of indigenous people, which will continue, but a lot of it will also be replaced with African slaves, right? And of course, cultural traditions, languages, all of those things are being exchanged back and forth as well. It's like two completely different worlds colliding, right? And kind of melding into one world. That is really the story of the history of the Americas. So if we look at this map in this diagram, we can kind of get a sense of, at least in this case, the foodstuffs that are moving back and forth between these two regions. So in the Americas, you have things like squash and yams, potatoes, chili peppers, tomatoes, corn, vanilla bean, the cacao for chocolate, pineapples, all of those things are moving from the Americas over to Europe, Africa, and Asia and being introduced there and also being integrated into a lot of the culinary traditions of those regions as well. And then from Europe and Africa and Asia into the Americas come things like citrus and onions, grapes, bananas, beets, bees, sugar cane, peaches, coffee, farm animals, and as we've already mentioned, diseases, right? So this is really going to transform the way that people experience their world, is this exchange. Um, So when the Spanish get to the Americas and you've got these diverse native communities throughout the U.S. Before contact, there's really so many differences between these two cultures. This really needs to be emphasized because it explains a lot of the miscommunication and a lot of the problems of initial contact in the Americas. So we're going to talk now about Native American culture. We're going to talk about some of the commonalities and some of the differences really between Native culture and European culture. So we're going to begin by talking about one of the most fundamental differences was the perception of human nature and human origins. So, origin stories. If we look at the origin stories from Christianity, for example, you find it in the book of Genesis in the Bible. And when you look at that, you see the Bible, you see its history. It's the Christian Bible describes in the beginning there was darkness, then God created light along with the world, and then one day the world would come to an end, right? So there's like this beginning, this middle, and this end. This belief is actually going to, at least if not overtly, at least subconsciously, influence Europeans into the perception that time progressed in a straight line, along with which human beings are moving forward. So this idea of linear thinking, this idea of linear progress, this idea that things have a beginning and a point or a climax and an end. On the other hand, when you look at many indigenous people and their belief systems, a lot of times their world is described as being cyclical and infinite, right? So the Aztecs, for example, believed that the world in which they lived was but the latest in a series of worlds that had been created and destroyed over time. And they had a belief that their world would continue to exist only so long as they fed the sun with the blood of sacrificial victims, right? In indigenous concepts of the cosmos, no hard separation existed between humans and nature. And so that comes to really our first point here, which is this belief in animism and this idea that that the spiritual world resided not just in humans, but also in animals, plants, and even rocks, right? This belief is very different from monotheism, in which the spiritual power resides just in a single divine being. So indigenous religions did not focus on sin or on the nature of good and evil. Instead, the spiritual world was a place full of power that humans could harness for either good or evil. So even though belief systems varied widely, all indigenous groups in the Western Hemisphere held these basic views about their existence and their relationship to others and to the world. So animism is huge here in terms of shaping the differences between these two cultures. Another thing that was pretty common throughout the indigenous world in the Americas was this idea of land as a common resource. So in European thinking, land is like a commodity. It could be bought, it could be sold, it could be owned, right? In indigenous thinking, land is a common resource, meaning that even though you could have territories, and they did, the different tribes had different territories, they had different tribal territories, they had different hunting territories, it wasn't ever owned by one particular individual. It was seen as something that was common to the tribe, and it was shared with the tribe, and it certainly couldn't be bought or sold. So this is huge, hugely different than the way that the Europeans are thinking about private land ownership. And it also creates a lot of problems when Europeans come along and they try to negotiate land deals. It's unclear if indigenous people really understood exactly what it was that they were agreeing to, because they didn't really have this concept of buying, selling land the way that the Europeans did. Generosity and gift giving and gift exchange was highly valued in indigenous cultures. And in fact, that was one of the ways in which Europeans were able to make friends, so to say, with the indigenous people, or show signs of peace, was to bring gifts. And this was very common. And Europeans that were better at this were the Spanish and the French. The English, when they begin to colonize the Americas, they're not quite as good at the gift-giving part, and that leads to a lot of cultural misunderstandings. Indigenous Americans also differed from Europeans of the 1400s in their approach to gender. While indigenous women did complete some of the same tasks as European women, such as cooking, making clothing, and raising children, they also took part in activities that Europeans believed should be done by men and that in Europe usually were. So, for example, in indigenous societies, women were the principal farmers and built the family's dwelling. In many groups, women were revered as imbued with sacred powers to heal and to create. This power also gave them a strong voice in the leadership of communities. So women would often sit on tribal councils and even, for example, be tribal chiefs. So, for example, in the Iroquois in North America, women often attended tribal councils to advise male clan representatives, and women chose the tribe's male leaders. Among the Wampanoag of southern New England, women could serve as tribal leaders. So, in many tribes, individuals who did not accept these traditional roles, so in addition to these gender roles being very different in indigenous communities, traditionally assigned roles in terms of gender, people of their sex, women who wish to live, for example, as men in indigenous societies, and men who wish to live and dress as women did not face punishment or maltreatment as long as they contribute to their societies in other ways. For example, in some indigenous societies, women became hunters and warriors. In many societies, men who felt they had been born with their souls of women dressed as women pursued women's occupations and became second or third wives of other men. So these gender reversals and these mixing of gender roles and stuff, this would have been something that would have been very unfamiliar to Europeans. And we know from a lot of the documents and things that when Europeans encountered this, they just saw it as another reason to ridicule indigenous societies and think of them as other or think of them as primitive. Okay, so this is the final slide for this lecture. We're going to talk about and summarize the importance of the Columbian Exchange. So the Columbian Exchange, the importance of it really cannot be overestimated. It will transform the world. The discovery, conquest, whatever you want to call it, of the Americas was fundamentally transformational for the entire world. Obviously, it's going to transform diets because new foodstuffs are going to be introduced. Economies are going to be transformed as new products are going to be able to. The region of the Americas allows for access to lots of resources. So for the Spanish, it's going to be silver and gold in particular is going to be really high commodity. But there are lots of other resources as well, including land that can be transformed into plantations, etc. So economies are going to be created from this Columbian Exchange. Environments are going to be transformed because of the introduction of new plants and animals. Obviously, the bringing of disease, which is going to kill, thousands and thousands, millions of indigenous people eventually. The introduction of European metals, weapons, all of those things are going to transform indigenous societies. And it's also going to create trading networks with indigenous societies because the Europeans really did rely upon the indigenous people for their survival, particularly in the early years. Products such as coffee and sugar are going to establish plantation systems, which will require large labor forces, which then lead to indentured labor and also slave labor, which leads to an increase in the Atlantic slave trade. And finally, of course, the introduction of cows, goats, sheep, pigs, chickens, and horses. Horses in particular are going to transform a lot of indigenous societies. Indigenous societies are going to take to horse riding, and it's going to transform the way that they are able to hunt and live. So all of these things are transformative in nature. And with the discovery of the Americas, the world is going to be forever changed. All right, more on this later. See ya.